President Joe Biden hosts a special U.S. ASEAN summit in Washington, D.C. What was on the agenda? Hi, everyone. I'm Sean Caleb, sitting in today for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Welcome all. The President of the United States has met with leaders from the Southeast Asia during a two-day summit. The U.S. ASEAN meetings took place at the White House and at the U.S. State Department. The meetings covered a wide range of issues, including security concerns, China, and the economy. And we begin with this report from CGTN White House correspondent Nathan King.
For Washington, D.C., this is a historic summit marking 45 years of engagement between the U.S. and ASEAN, that 10-member grouping that really represents everyone pretty much in Southeast Asia. However, there have been criticisms. The U.S. pledged $150 million only to the regional organization and largely addressing Washington's priorities of maritime security. We're going to send U.S. Coast Guard trainers to ASEAN. There will be a U.S. Coast Guard cutter based in Oceania. This should raise eyebrows in Beijing and elsewhere. They're also spending money on potentially infrastructure, perhaps leading to billions of dollars worth of investment. But what really the ASEAN members wanted here is a trade deal. Remember, the U.S. is absent from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, absent from the RCEP deal, which was an ASEAN-led process along with China. And really the U.S. alternative, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, has been sort of dead in the water. Let's listen to the closing remarks of the last couple of days.
Discussions have covered a broad range of critical issues, including working together to keep up the fight against COVID-19, to take climate action, pursue a clean energy future, build a sustainable high-standard infrastructure, and to expand access to education, enhance maritime cooperation. And the breadth of our discussions reflect just how vital the Indo-Pacific and ASEAN region are to the United States of America from our perspective.
Now, the U.S. says that it's not asking ASEAN nations gathered here to choose, but it does have concerns about the region. Myanmar, for example, they say the five-point plan has stalled. They would like other non-ASEAN voices to weigh in. They are also concerned very much. Human rights has been pushed here as well, and more support for the U.S. position on Ukraine. The U.S. has falsely said that most ASEAN members are on board. Well, many ASEAN members say they don't really have anything at stake in the fight between Russia and Ukraine, but they are feeling the effects of the global price spike in commodities, from everything from wheat to oil. So they are talking. It's been very friendly. It's good to have this summit, but the lack of new money, the lack of a trade deal, and the lack of understanding on the future when it comes to a $3 trillion economy, which is ASEAN is, and how it fits into U.S. plans, considering they have had more ad hoc alliances that seem to be paying more attention to, like AUKUS, for example, the military alliance with the UK and Australia, and the Quad with India, Japan, and, of course, Australia. The President will travel later this month to the Republic of Korea and Japan. It's going to be interesting to see how much more emphasis they place on that trip than this summit here. Nathan King, CGTN, just outside the U.S. State Department.
And as always, we have a great panel assembled to discuss all of this. Joining us from Kuala Lumpur is Peter Chang. Peter is the Deputy Director at the Institute of Chinese Studies at the University of Malaya. Also with us from Hong Kong is Reuben Mondejar. He is President of the Asian Studies Association of Hong Kong. And joining the discussion here in Washington, D.C., Sourabh Gupta. Sourabh is the Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist with the Institute for China-American Studies. And also from Beijing, we are joined by Victor Gao. Victor is a chair professor at the Soochow University and a current affairs commentator as well. Gentlemen, thanks to all of you for taking time. I look forward to what I hope is some lively discussion here. Sourabh, if I can, I'd like to start with you. The New York Times said that the ASEAN summit right now is really an effort by the United States, the White House, to deliver a message of solidarity with ASEAN leaders, and also, if you will, to build up a bulwark of sorts against China as the United States tries to get its tentacles into that region for some kind of trade and also for any kind of security issues.
Yes, I'd agree, but up to a point. I think what the US's fundamental purpose out here was, and I'd say unfortunately, is to show that we haven't forgotten you. We have to remember that Donald Trump, the Trump administration, Mr. Trump went to Asia, to the ASEAN-led summits once, never showed up after that. In his Indo-Pacific strategy, ASEAN was essentially lumped with the Pacific states and dumped at the far end of that strategy memo. So the ASEAN countries are looking for commitment, and especially at a time of when COVID-19 is still around, we have the Ukraine conflict, America is embroiled with with January 6th issues. And so they're looking for that commitment, and this was just America saying, yes, we haven't forgotten you, Indo-Pacific region is important. But they have then queried that pitch, queried that pitch a bit by saying, you look, we are committed to the region. We did AUKUS, we are doing Quad. Hey, none of those include ASEAN. And ASEAN is saying, no, we need something better and more than that. So I would say, yes, the US is trying to show that there's a broad agenda with ASEAN, but I'll also submit that agenda is a mile wide and an inch deep, and the US has a lot of work to do still.
Interesting. Peter, I'd like you to pick up on that. Is it a message of we haven't forgotten you? And also, consider this. Is it also a time when the United States is basically sort of pushing these nations to say, look, we want you to choose between China and the United States? Do you think that there's any feeling of that?
Yes, I think there is this need for Washington to give this moment face time at the leadership level to back up with all the talks about committed to Southeast Asia and ASEAN. And I think this is an important optic moment to show that the leadership is committed to ASEAN. And I think we appreciate that. But it needs to be followed up with more deliverable and tangibles. We are not exactly sure what will be translated beyond this summit. And the second question as to whether ASEAN would like to take sides is very clear. The ASEAN's message has always been very consistent that we would prefer not to have to alienate any of the stakeholders in this region in our pursuit for peace and prosperity. And this has always been the consistent ASEAN message, that it is an inclusive, cooperative endeavor that we would like to see happening in this part of the world. And it's the basic principle that underpins the ASEAN centrality concept, where we are open to all, I think.
Well, Reuben,
I hope the message has got to Washington.
Indeed. Reuben, ASEAN's message has always remained the same. But what about the United States pushing and saying, look, you know, China has made some claims to the area, especially South China Sea, security concerns. We really want to get these ASEAN nations on board. And especially right now, if you try to consider that the U.S. is exerting this influence at a time when relations between China and the United States are at a low ebb. And how are ASEAN nations dealing with this, trying to balance between Washington and Beijing?
Well, you just mentioned, I think this is the most hot button issue, the South China Sea. Of the 10 members of the ASEAN, not everyone has a very direct interest in the issue. For example, in the non-littoral states, such as Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, Thailand, so they don't really face the South China Sea. But at the same time, I would say that the bigger members, the more influential members of the ASEAN are very concerned, including small state Singapore, because, you know, whatever happens in the South China Sea has a lot of repercussions, not just in economics, not just in diplomacy, not just in the politics and rivalry between the U.S. and China, because this is considered also an international issue. So that it's not just an ASEAN-US issue. The EU joins in because, you know, the South China Sea accounts for 60% of the maritime trade that is happening in the world. So whatever happens there, so the U.S. really has to make its points very clear how they can engage the ASEAN countries without making the ASEAN say to China that go away, we're not interested in you. So how to balance these two? The ASEAN will not say no to China, because China is there in the is the big elephant in the room. So you cannot shoo them away. So how does the U.S. do that? So that's I think the most important thing, that the U.S. should work with ASEAN.
Well, our good friend Victor Gao has been waiting patiently in Beijing to kind of jump into this. I'd like to get your reaction to what some of the guests had to say, Victor, and also the fact that China is at the front door of all these ASEAN nations. How is Beijing looking at what is playing out here in Washington, both at the State Department and at the White House?
Thank you very much. ASEAN is one of the most important regional organizations in the world, and the 10 ASEAN nations are very, very important for peace and stability in the Asian Pacific region, as well as in the world. Now, for the United States to pay more attention to ASEAN, in a sense, is a good thing, is a positive development. However, the focus should be really on promoting peace and development and cooperation and partnership, rather than, for example, creating more tensions or inciting confrontation or conflict or even war. Because I think each of the 10 ASEAN member states have their own independence of mind, have their own judgment, have their own national interests to take care of, and they will really make the right choice for their own countries, as well as for ASEAN as a whole, and for this whole region in Asia Pacific. So I hope the United States will do the right thing rather than the wrong thing, and to incite tensions between China and the United States within the ASEAN framework is a suicidal attempt, because I think many of the ASEAN countries know that China and ASEAN countries have been here for more than thousands of years, predating by many, many centuries the relations between ASEAN countries and the United States. So I think this is a reality. The United States need to deal with this in a pragmatical way rather than inciting conflict or confrontation.
Sir, do you think that's an accurate portrayal? Do you think the United States is pushing at it in some sort of way that is going to garner attention, that is going to raise certain red flags there? We know that, think about what happened when former President Obama made his very famous Asian pivot a number of years ago, and all the attention and all the concern that it raised in Beijing.
Yes, I agree up to a point. Let me tell you what is the hole in the American strategy with regard to ASEAN and in the Indo-Pacific region. The Trump administration made it very clear that it was U.S. versus China, and we are in a world of strategic competition. And yes, the Biden administration has tacitly and overtly moved on the same lines. But what the Biden administration is trying to do is do this a little softly, that it doesn't antagonize China while it can still build relationships in the region. Now, here is the hole in the strategy. This works in the security arena. I'm talking of a minus China strategy, where you have minilateral organizations like AUKUS, like Quad, which doesn't have China in them. And it works up to a point. But the problem is that in things like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or on economic and on economic cooperation related issues, China is bang in the middle of all the supply chains and at the heart of the Asian economy. And to have a minus China strategy is just an absurd proposition. And that's why, to an extent, even the Quad is going to fail, because it is trying to do non-security work when all the lines, all the paths go through Beijing. And that's why the Americans need to become a little bit more clear-minded on this. On the security area, you can wedge the issue and do U.S. versus China and say you're a defender of international law, et cetera, et cetera. But on the economic issues, you need to champion inclusive economic regionalism. Otherwise, the United States, is going to be the one looking inside from the outside. And I don't think that message has really sunk in at the US's end, but it will, simply because what's on the table on offer from the US side on the economic side to ASEAN is just very, very weak.
Peter, I think that many could argue that Sourabh just made some very good points there. If you think about the trade deals that China does have with so many ASEAN nations and the fact that TTP was a failure for the United States, they did not get involved in RCEP to this point. Let's take a look at what's going forward, because the U.S. says that it really wants to have this relationship, but at the same time, if you look at President Biden's to-do list every day, I'm sure 1, 2, and 3 have to deal with something going on in Ukraine. Do you think the ASEAN nations have a right, or can you understand how they would feel being kind of cast aside and certainly not first on the president's to-do list?
Absolutely. I think the president is absolutely distracted by events elsewhere, and we just feel that we are not exactly sure we are at the center of his agenda either. And there is also question whether all this initiative that has been announced today, how long will it last? Will it survive the current administration past 2024, 2028? You know, there's so many changes in terms of strategies when it comes to ASEAN, and we're getting used to it. There are so many different kind of approaches and strategies, but the bottom line is this fundamental problem that we have. Even with understanding what free and open Indo-Pacific is, for us in ASEAN, free and open Indo-Pacific means an open table, an open round table for everyone. Whereas the Americans have a different idea of what free and open Indo-Pacific is. So we are basically speaking at two different wavelengths, and I don't think we are actually meeting at the same point right now.
And Reuben, let's take a look at what happened yesterday. It was Vice President Kamala Harris that met with the leaders of the ASEAN nations, not U.S. President Joe Biden. And in terms of the economic relationship, the White House has announced a commitment for $150 million, but I think a lot of nations may be thinking that's a very, very small amount, especially considering the fact China has pledged $1.5 billion, and at least $50 million of that is going to go for the U.S. Coast Guard to work with the authorities over there in terms of some kind of security within the South China Sea, presumably. So what do you think about Biden's announcement that $150 million is a very significant amount moving forward when you talk about issues such as COVID and you talk about the strain on various nations since what's going on in Ukraine?
Okay, we'll have to distinguish the hard power issues and the soft power issues. The $150 million, I'm sorry to say, but it's peanuts. It's a laughable amount. If the U.S. thinks that this is going to sway ASEAN one way or the other, I think they are deluding themselves. $150 million is nothing. So that's why I think the U.S. has to know which buttons to press. So if they think that by pressing the economic button, by putting $150 million, they are very wrong in that sense. So they have to go to the real, things that will really affect ASEAN. For example, I said earlier, the South China Sea is an issue. So how to prevent tensions? What should the U.S. do? Just last week, a warship passed by the Taiwan Strait, reaching the 9-dash line. So those are the things that the U.S. should make sure that the ASEAN understands what its position is, not causing tension, not allowing even a division, putting a wedge between China and ASEAN, because that's very much something that ASEAN would not like to be doing.
And Victor, to use Reuben's take on that, it's peanuts, $150 million. People in Beijing must be sitting back thinking, if this is your best offer, and at the same time you hear the White House talking repeatedly about how important ASEAN's relationship is to the United States, perhaps not really spelling it out in return what that region gets. How is Beijing looking at this? If you consider 660 million people in the ASEAN nations and China, their #1 trading partner, Beijing must feel pretty good right about now.
I personally cannot help but chuckling at this. For example, if I personally make a contribution of 150 million to my alma mater, it may be a significant amount and making my alma mater very happy. But for the United States, the largest economy in the world, to contribute 150 million to ASEAN with 10 member states, for example, especially in comparison with the so-called $40 billion contribution of the United States to Ukraine, plus all the other contributions the United States has already made to the war effort over there, I think everyone in ASEAN will be chuckling and will really conclude that this is really not a very serious sign of commitment to peace and stability and prosperity and good neighborly relations between the United States and ASEAN as a whole. I hope the United States will soon realize that war and peace is a very important thing. In the ASEAN region, in our region, East Asia, ASEAN, you name it, we want to have peace and development. We know that development is the hard truth. You need to promote development. And by promoting development, you need to have connectivity, you need to have good neighborly relations, you need to respect each other, culture-wise, as well as history, background, etc., you name it. So I think this is the highway. This is the better way. And to try to focus on confrontation, to really split countries into different groups fighting against each other, I don't think ASEAN does not have enough brain power to realize that that's the wrong thing for ASEAN and for the whole world.
Well, Victor, real quickly, you have a great deal of experience in dealing with diplomatic issues, just considering all the wonderful things that you've done in your professional life. If you had a chance to sit down with President Joe Biden and you said in 1 minute, here's what I think you should do, what would you tell the U.S.?
Thank you very much. I would say, Mr. Biden, China is not an enemy of the United States, and the Chinese people are not enemies of the American people. Deal with China as it is, deal with the Chinese people with respect, and then you will really have the peace of mind and prosperity not only for the United States, but for the whole world. Peace with China is the megatrend and the future of the world.
And, sir, we know that President Biden is getting ready to head to South Korea as well as Japan to push his administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. If tensions continue to escalate between China and the United States, how do you see ASEAN nations sort of weighing in on this?
If there are those tensions, I think ASEAN is going to be somewhat hands-off. It depends on what that tension is. If it's on the Korean Peninsula, ASEAN is not really a player. On the Taiwan Straits, ASEAN will not really get involved, but it may want to tamp down on those tensions. But ASEAN's main point is that we are a united entity. Don't wedge us out here. We want to stay united, and we want to be a pillar of stability. And on that basis, let us have development going forward. And I think the Americans do understand that message. They tried to cater to that message. They just didn't have enough to offer. And frankly, I think they have gone and contradicted themselves at times in the run-up to this summit by, as I mentioned, by flagging Quad, by flagging the Solomon Islands issue, by flagging AUKUS, and by even saying, I mean, this was a little bit shocking that a senior administration official would say this yesterday, that remember, this is the Indo-Pacific economic framework, not the ASEAN economic framework. ASEAN is looking for a position in that framework which is meaningful and beneficial reciprocally for everybody in the region. And I understand that supply chains, at least the top tier of supply chains, runs through the Koreas and the Taiwans and the Japans. But ASEAN is a big player out there, and one cannot be saying these sort of things. So ASEAN wants to be a pillar of stability and try to ensure that they can offer their good services to not mediate, but to facilitate a conversation. But if things get hot, I think ASEAN would leave it to the parties to figure it out.
Peter, I want to pick up on what Sourabh was talking about, because one thing we really haven't gone into at this point is COVID-19 and how that has just dramatically affected every nook and cranny of the world, and certainly the trading that goes on in ASEAN nations. You'd think that the United States would have been perhaps more concerned, made more about that in its discussions, and certainly trying to find a way to help ASEAN nations out of this. Do you think that the U.S. has done enough, or what could it do?
No, unfortunately. Actually, when it comes to COVID pandemic, the response, it was the Chinese that took the lead in terms of Southeast Asians' response to the pandemic. Malaysia, for example, Pfizer was our top vaccine because it's the most effective. And we had to fall on Sinovac as a support vaccine. But it was Sinovac, the Chinese vaccine, that was most readily available. And the Chinese themselves has agreed to help us to our local vaccine production. This is partly part of the public health global initiative that they have to help us to recover from the pandemic. But more to the point of economic recovery, this year, China and Malaysia have signed up to the Comprehensive Strategic Initiative Partnership, and we have both also signed on, ratified the RCEP. These two are very important initiatives that will help to jumpstart the lockdown pandemic-induced economic slowdown. But the United States is completely out of this. So we're not too sure how America could be a part of this very critical economic recovery that we are in right now.
And Reuben, I also want to kind of transition just a bit, talk about the fact that the Philippines just elected a new president, President Marcos Jr. How is the Philippines going to react with ASEAN nations moving forward after this election?
Okay, I want to point out that I think we somehow in the discussion, we are forgetting that ASEAN is not that united. One of the illnesses of ASEAN is since 1967, when it was founded, it never really found its cohesion that is unquestionable. So if the U.S. wants to deal with ASEAN, it has to go to those issues that benefit individual countries. Then when those countries feel the benefits, then they will feel that there is a need to join together among themselves and be an ASEAN voice. But to just say, I deal with ASEAN, I give you this 100, that's not going to do anything, because ASEAN, after all, is not that united.
It's not a collective.
So, yeah, it's just, in name. We have seen how ASEAN has behaved in Myanmar, in East Timor. So ASEAN is not able really to be an effective collective entity. So if the U.S. wants to deal with ASEAN, it has to go through each of the countries and address the national interest of each country, and then find the commonality about these interests, and then there.
It is a challenge. And gentlemen, I want to thank all of you for our discussion today. Certainly eye-opening for me. That does it for another edition of The Heat. Thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great weekend. And please join us for The Heat next time.